had a good spring break. Back to classes. So we have about a month, a little over a month remaining for the semester. Just to keep you all up to date with where we are. So we did the midterm. Okay. First lab is also done. I'm going to hand out the second lab this week. So we have 3 labs total. Okay, so one is done. Because of all the snow delays, it's a little late, but we got that done. Second lab I'm going to hand out this week. It's going to be due in 2 weeks, and then there will be a third lab that I'll hand out in mid-April. That will be due in another 2 weeks, and then the semester will be done by end of April. And then there will be a couple of homework still, and final exam. The final exam is always take-home exam. Okay. Any comments on the lab? I know that several of you turned it in after the midterm. Well, maybe most of you, I don't know how many turned it in on time. Anything that I should keep in mind as we roll out the next lab? Everybody had access to EdLab and all of that. You could check your code. Anything, if you have any comments about any aspect of the lab that you want more elaboration or clarification, let me know, because we are going to follow roughly the same structure for the second lab and the third. Okay? Okay, so let's get started now. It's been over 2 weeks since we had a lecture, so I'm just going to do a quick recap. If you remember, last time we were talking about leader election and distributed mutual exclusion. Okay, leader election is the problem of a set of processes in a distributed system that elect a coordinator, okay, or a leader. The coordinator is responsible for some task within the application, and if the coordinator crashes, you elect a new leader. Okay, you run the leader election algorithm again and elect a new leader. So we saw several different algorithms to implement leader election. Okay? And then towards the end of the class, I was talking about distributed locks, or distributed mutual exclusion. And this is the problem of a group of processes of which some subset need to access a shared resource. Okay? Like in any synchronization problem, any access to a shared resource requires a lock. Okay? Now here, because the processes are decentralized, they're distributed, they're not part of the same process, you cannot use a lock within a process that you have used in other contexts. Okay? So you need the processes as a group to implement the abstraction of a lock. Okay? And we looked at a centralized approach, which was you had a coordinator. Okay, so there was a coordinator process. You send lock request to the coordinator decides based on which request came and what the lock state is, who gets the lock. Okay? And then processes have to go back to the coordinator, release the lock, and it looks at the queue of lock requests that have arrived in the meantime, grant the lock to the next process, and so on. Okay, that was a very straightforward centralized approach. What we did not do last time were 2 or 3 other approaches that are decentralized, that do not require this coordinator. Okay, a coordinator is, as I mentioned last time, is a single point of failure, not to mention that any centralized approach might have bottlenecks in terms of scalability and so on. Okay? So we are going to look at actually 3 different approaches that do away with the notion of having a lock coordinator to implement a distributed lock. So the first approach is a decentralized approach. It is going to use voting. Okay, so what will happen in this case is you are assuming that you have 8 replicas and you have a thread for each replica that is going to decide what to vote. Okay, so if you have a process, if you have n processes, within each process there is one thread that is responsible for lock acquisition and voting and so on. Okay? And that is what is the coordinator thread. Okay? It's not a centralized coordinator, it's a thread within each process or within each replica. Okay? So to acquire a lock, you broadcast a request saying I need a lock. Okay? And what you need is at least a majority of the processes, a strict majority, which is m, the number of processes that agree to grant you a lock should be strictly greater than half. Okay, if a strict majority agree that you can have the lock, then the process gets the lock. Okay, so processes are going to vote. And coordinator can return either a yes or a no upon getting a lock request. Okay. So the idea is if you get a strict majority, then you are basically done. Okay. Now, if some process says they have the lock, obviously you are not going to get a strict majority, okay, because they would have said yes to some other process. So essentially, you are going to keep track of the lock state within each process. Is the lock free? Is the lock been given to some other process? Has the lock been released? Whenever a new process asks, you ask, what do I know about the lock? If the lock is in use, you say you cannot have the lock, it's in use. Okay? If the lock is free, then you say that, okay, go ahead and have the lock. If a majority of the processes all agree that the lock is free and you can have the lock, then you are done. Okay? Now in this case, if the coordinator crashes, you can essentially ignore the previous, ignore whatever you learned, because there are other coordinators or other coordinator threads in other processes which are still going to give you a majority. If more than half the processes crash, obviously the technique is not going to work. Okay? But there is no single point of failure. If one process crashes, it doesn't prevent others from making progress, because there is a notion of a coordinator thread in each process that's keeping track of what is going on in the log. Okay? So you essentially take the centralized approach and you implement the approach in each process, and all processes vote based on whatever the coordinator thread within that process says should be done whenever a new lock request comes. Okay? So there is some analysis here which talks about probability of a crash and so on. I'm going to ignore that here. We'll come back to all of this when we look at fault tolerance. Okay? But the basic idea is you're going to have a thread in each process that keeps track of the lock, and then you vote depending on what is going on. Okay. This is a different approach. Okay. There's a second approach in distributed locking is called the Rickard and Agrawala approach, based on the people who proposed or wrote the first paper proposing this approach. Okay. So this approach is going to be based now on some concepts we already studied so far, which is event ordering and timestamps. Okay. We talked about Lamport's clocks, we talked about the happened before relationship and so on and so forth. We are going to use that concept to implement the notion of a lock. Okay? So we are going to assume that there is a total ordering of events in the system. This can be based using multicast messages. So every message goes to all processes and all messages are ordered. Okay? Every process is going to receive a broadcast of every message that's sent in the system. Okay? You are going to get a total order. Okay? And then what we are going to do is we are going to use Lamport's clock. You can also use vector clocks for this. Okay? To timestamp each message. Okay? And the message is simply I want to acquire a lock or I want to release a lock. Those are the messages we care about, not other messages the processes may be exchanging. The only messages we care about here are the messages to acquire lock, release lock, and so on. Okay? So now if you want, if process K needs to enter a critical section, it is going to increment its local counter, okay, the local timestamp of the Lamport's clock, and it's going to say I want a lock request, and it's going to say I'm process K, this is my timestamp, and it's going to send this to all other processes. Okay. And then you have to wait until each of those other processes sends a yes reply. Okay. In this case, there's no concept of a no reply. You just block until everyone tells you yes. Okay. Some processes may immediately send you yes, others may take a little longer to send a yes. But until you get a yes from everyone, you block. Okay, saying I'm waiting for the lock. And once everyone else says yes, go ahead, then you are going to enter the critical section. Okay. So this is the process to acquire a lock. You increment your timestamp, you send a lock acquire request to everyone, you wait for yeses from everyone. Okay. Now how is the timestamp working? This is what is going to happen at all the other n-1 processes. So if you are a process that receives a lock acquire request from some other process, say you are process J and you received a lock acquire request from process K. Right? So now you have three cases here. Case one is you don't have any interest in the lock. Okay, you don't. This process doesn't need the lock at this point. There's no contention. In this case, this process is going to say yes, saying go ahead. I don't need the lock. Okay, that's called a reply message. Okay. Now, if this process is already in the critical section, the second case is if you're already holding the lock. First case is you don't hold the lock, you don't need the lock. So you just say yes. Okay? Second case is you are actually holding the lock at this point in time. In this case, you are going to actually wait. You do not reply. You queue this request, and only after you exit the critical section are you going to say yes. Okay, that makes sense. If you hold the lock, you cannot let some other process get the lock. Okay? And the third scenario is that you do not hold the lock, but you also have an interest in acquiring the lock. So you have yourself send lock acquire request to all other processes. Okay? So in this case, there is contention for the lock. Process K wants the lock, process J wants the lock. Okay? So there is going to be contention. And we are going to use the timestamp to resolve who gets the lock. Okay? So in this case, what you are going to do is, if you want to enter the critical section, you compare your timestamp, okay, timestamp of J, with the timestamp of this other process K that sent you. Okay? If your timestamp is greater, that means the other process sent the request first. You are just doing happened before relationship. So you are just comparing timestamp and say which of the two processes sent the request first, and that's the process that's going to win. Okay, you need a way to break the tie. Okay, there are two processes contending. One of them can win, or two or more processes contending. One of them is going to win. And the way you decide who wins is you say which of the two processes sent the lock acquire request first. You're going to compare the two timestamps. If your timestamp is higher, that means the other processes lock acquire message was sent before yours. Okay, so you are going to yield the lock to the other process. So you are going to send a reply if your timestamp is greater. Timestamp of K's timestamp is strictly less than your timestamp. You let that process. Otherwise, you wait, and the K will actually yield to you, and you will win. Okay. So whenever there are multiple processes contending, the one with the least timestamp is going to win because that's the one that sent the request first. Okay, every other process, because you're total ordering, every other process's timestamp is going to be strictly greater than yours. And that's basically going to determine what's happening. Is this clear? Okay, so this is using several different concepts we have seen so far. Using Lamport's clock, you can also use vector clocks as I mentioned, and you're going to use total ordering, and you're using Lamport's clock to reason about which of the processes has actually made the first request to get the lock whenever there is contention. Okay, that's the process there. So you basically are going to grant locks in Lamport clock order, or grant locks in the order of Lamport's clocks values. Any questions on this? Is this clear first of all? Okay. So let me ask a question. How is this algorithm's fault tolerance property compared to a centralized approach? In the centralized approach, we said if the coordinator crashes, then you are going to be stuck. Okay? You cannot get any more lock acquire, lock release messages. All of them are going to be stuck because there's no coordinator. Okay? In this case, this is a distributed approach. Okay? There's no centralized coordinator. So is the fault tolerance of this approach better, same, worse than centralized approach? Okay, and answer is better. Distributors will be better. Anyone have any disagreement, opinions on this? So I think the answer to the question depends on doing a little bit of analysis of what happened. Let's say there's no coordinator here. Okay, let's say arbitrary process crashes. Okay, some process in the system is crashed. Okay. Now process K wants to enter critical section. Okay, what does it do? It's going to execute this algorithm. It's going to increment its timestamp. It's going to send a request to all n-1 processes, and it's going to wait for replies or yeses from everyone. Okay, so now one process has crashed. So what does that do? Crashed process. So So the process has crashed clearly, so it's not going to reply. That should be clear. The process dead, it cannot actually reply to message saying, can I get the lock? Okay, so you will receive your yeses, let's say, from the remaining n minus 2 processes. Okay, those are all, let's say, nobody else wants the lock, so you'll get a yes from the remaining n minus 2. There's one crash process that's not replying to. Okay, so now what? What do we do? Okay, the scenario is clear, right? One process crashed. Process K wants to enter the critical section. It sends a lock request to all other processes. The remaining active processes say go ahead. The crash process does not reply because it's no longer active. So now what does process K to do?
Once more send a request and check if it reaches the process. If it doesn't reach,
Okay, so you can retry. Okay, so you can keep sending the request. If process K is crashed, retries will not get any responses. Okay, so of course you can retry to make sure it was the network didn't drop your message and so on. Okay, so the main problem that you are going to see is you cannot ignore. So even if you realize that process K has crashed, not K, but this process J has crashed, you cannot just ignore it and just go ahead and acquire the critical section because you do not know the state of the process when it crashed. What if that process held the lock when you had crashed? You can't simply say process is gone, the others have said yes, so I'm going to take the lock. You cannot make that decision because you don't know the state of the lock because that process could have held the lock. Okay? Or it may not, it may have just crashed without holding the lock, but you can't distinguish. So you cannot basically distinguish between why there is no reply. Basically the process has crashed, but you cannot figure out did the process crash holding the lock or did the process crash not holding the lock. So there is no safe way for this process to move ahead. Okay, because all it can do is wait and hope that this crash process comes back up and then eventually it will reply because you are trying to reach it. Okay? But until you do that, you are going to be blocked. Because the only safe thing is to block and wait because you cannot enter the critical section because if the processor was holding the lock, that's bad. Or two processes are in the critical section. So that is going to violate the safety property of a lock, which is only one process can be in the critical section. Okay? Is that clear? So now having gone through this, what does this tell you about the failure properties of this algorithm? That was my question, which is what led us to this analysis. This is a better fault tolerance property or worse fault tolerance property. It's a centralized approach. Okay, centralized approach, if the coordinator crashes, the algorithm stops working. If an arbitrary process crashes, so long as it was not holding the lock, it doesn't impact anything else. Okay, because the coordinator is still alive. If it sees the one process has crashed, what does it care? So long as the lock is not held by the crash process, other processes can make progress. Okay? In this algorithm, any arbitrary process crashes, okay, the lock algorithm is not going to allow any process to make progress. Because you are not going to get a reply from that process if some other process wants to enter the critical section and you're stuck. Okay? Is that clear? What does this tell you? This is better or worse than? Yes.
I think it's worse because centralized algorithm, the probability of coordinator fails is less than the probability that any of the processes in this distributed algorithm fails.
Okay, so this, as was pointed out, in the centralized approach, if processes crash with equal probability, coordinator will crash with probability 1 over n. Okay? In this case, any process crashing is going to hold the algorithm. Okay? And the probability of any process crashing is higher than the probability of one process crashing. Okay? So you will see that this is a fully decentralized approach, but there are n point of failure. Here, there are n points of failures. So this is a rare scenario that you will see where your distributed algorithm is actually worse than the centralized approach. By and large, that's not the case. When you take a centralized algorithm, you make it distributed, things get better in terms of fault tolerance properties and scalability and whatnot. Okay? Here is an exception, where you made the algorithm distributed, saying what if the coordinator crashes is a central point of failure, and things actually, your failure properties got worse because every process is involved in the decision making, and even if one process is not up, then you cannot make progress. Okay, is that clear? Any questions here before I move on? Okay, so there's one more algorithm that I'm going to talk about and then move on. This one is the token ring algorithm. Okay, this is the same algorithm that was also used in token ring LAN protocols, if anybody has actually heard of token ring LAN. Okay, back in the days when local area networking technologies were being invented, there were two competing technologies, token ring and Ethernet. Okay, you can imagine which one won, because you don't hear of token ring, and Ethernet is pretty standard on all machines. But when they were actually both active the development, and when you bought a PC, you had to say which card do you want. You want a PC with an Ethernet card, or do you want a PC with a token ring card? And the answer depended on what kind of network is your PC going to be plugged in. If your company had invested in token ring, you had to buy PC with token ring, otherwise you had to buy Ethernet. Okay, they were not compatible, they were two different techniques. Okay. And by and large, the technique, before I talk about locking, I'm going to tell you a little bit about history of token ring, and then we'll see why that naturally also gives us distributed locking algorithm. So in a token ring protocol, a network token ring protocol, not a locking protocol, you have a set of nodes. Okay, they could be PCs. They're organized in a logical ring. Okay, so think about PCs are actually literally connected by wires to two neighbors. Okay, so you basically have a card, and then you basically connect it to two machines, and each of the machine is connected to another machine. It forms a ring. Okay. So now, in this case, what happens is there's a special packet, network packet called a token that's circulating in the ring. Okay. And if you want to transmit any packets to any other machines in the ring or to the internet, you have to wait for the token. Okay. Is that clear? There's a special packet called a token, it's circulating, and essentially it's going to keep going around in the ring. And if you want to transmit, you have to wait for the token to come in. When you hold the token, you can send packets, and then you are guaranteed no one else will send packets because only you hold the token. There's only one token in the system. Okay? So what this is doing for you is it's preventing the chances that two machines are going to send data at the same time, and that's going to result in a network collision. If multiple machines start transmitting, then the packets basically cross over the wire, and that results in garbage. Okay. Even in Ethernet, you are going to, if you know anything about networking, you will know that there is a collision avoidance and a collision detection protocol in Ethernet. If multiple machines start transmitting at the same time, there's a randomized back off, saying some machines will back off and retry, and eventually, because of the randomization, only one machine is allowed to transmit. Okay. Here you are going to have, rather than a randomized algorithm, you essentially wait for the token to come to you. Okay. Token essentially is giving you a lock on the entire network. When you have the token, only you are the token, so you are guaranteed no one else is transmitting, so you can freely transmit and your packets will get through. There will be no collision on the wire. Okay. So that was the token ring LAN protocol. The idea was that a token packet is a packet called a token is going to circulate. When you get the token, you can transmit, and you can hold the token for some period of time. If you have a lot of data to transmit, you get a time slot saying if you hold the token, you get the next 200 milliseconds to transmit. If you have more data, send the token, wait for it to come around, and only then can you transmit. And that ensures fairness. Otherwise, you could hold the token and transmit for hours, and no one else gets to transmit. Okay, so it's like CPU scheduling, where once you get to run, there's a time slot. Okay, same is true here. When you get a token, you are going to get a time slot. If you don't have any data to transmit, you just send it around to the next neighbor. Okay, is that clear? So now you can understand why token ring requires a locking inherently as part of the protocol, because essentially you want to transmit without some other machine transmitting and cause collision, so you wait for the token. Okay. So now you can take the LAN part out of the token ring protocol and simply use the idea that a packet called a token gets your lock that nobody else holds in the system. And you can use the lock for any other arbitrary purpose, not for transmitting on the network. So this idea simply generalizes to a distributed lock protocol. In a distributed lock protocol, you will be given n processes. Okay? You won't have a physical ring, okay? But you can just number the processes 0 to n minus 1 and make a logical ring. What a logical ring does is, for the purposes of the locking protocol, process I is going to talk to process I minus 1 and I plus 1. And then we'll have a special packet called a token that's going to circulate. Yeah. And if you need to grab the lock, you just don't do anything. You just wait for the token to come to you. Once the token comes to you, you have the lock. You can enter your critical section, do whatever you want to do, and then when you exit the critical section, you give the lock to someone. Because when you execute code, you can't put any time limits. When you hold the lock in this case, it's like any other lock. You can hold it for arbitrary periods of time and then you release the lock, like any other lock. Okay, so you can simply take the same idea and implement a distributed locking protocol that is now used for any arbitrary critical section. Okay, in token ring LAN protocol, what you did when you got the lock was you sent packets. Here you can do whatever else you want. Okay, you can implement any other algorithm, any other thing you want once you grab the lock. Access shared data, access a database, whatever else you want, you can implement. Okay? Yes?
Is the logical ring only for tokens?
Yes. So the logical ring, so this n processes can talk to one another directly for their actual application. But for the purposes of locking, you are going to arrange them in a logical ring. And so in this case, I will talk to only I plus 1 and I minus 1. But for any other thing, you can directly talk, 3 can talk to 6 using network sockets, RPCs, whatever else you want. Okay. So the ring is only restricted to the locking protocol. Okay. The processes can directly talk to one another for the application itself, whatever else they are trying. Okay, is that clear? Yeah, there are certain interesting aspects of this that are I'm not going to go into them, but I just want to mention them, which is if the packet is lost, the token packet is a distinguished packet in the system, it gets lost for some reason. What do you do? Because if you just sit and wait, the token is not going to come to you. Okay? Now detecting a loss in the token is a non-trivial problem, because you cannot distinguish between a lost packet, a token that is lost, and some process that is simply entered a long critical section. Okay, so how do you distinguish between the two cases? The token doesn't come to you for a while. You waited 15 minutes, there's no sign on the token. How can you figure out that the token is actually disappeared versus there is some process that's sitting there and it's executing a long critical section, sitting in a loop, doing a lot of computation? You cannot figure out which of the two cases is true. Okay. What happened in the LAN part of token ring was because each process had an upper bound in the amount of time it could hold the token. It was guaranteed that if T was the maximum amount of time you could hold the token, and there are n processes in the system, every n times T seconds the token has to come to you. Okay? So if n time T period passes and the token doesn't come to you, you know that the token is lost. Okay? You can regenerate the token. But in an arbitrary lock protocol, you can't put a limit saying you hold the lock, you have to execute the critical section in time T. You cannot say that because this could be arbitrary code. Okay. So there is no guarantee how long the token may take to circulate. Unlike a token ring protocol where you could actually detect the loss of a token, in an arbitrary locking protocol there is no guarantee. Any process can hold the token for any arbitrary period of time. Okay. So you cannot actually, if the token gets lost, you cannot distinguish that case from the case where there are processes sitting in long critical section. Okay, so in this case, if there is a failure, which is the loss of a token, okay, or a process actually holding the token goes down, it's going to be hard to figure out. Okay, the protocol itself is very simple. when all works well, things are good, but if something goes wrong, this process actually, this algorithm needs more sophisticated techniques to figure out what is going on. Okay, so I just want to mention that. I won't go into how to regenerate the token here. So here is just a comparison of the 4 techniques we saw: centralized, decentralized, distributed token ring. You see the centralized approach, there are 3 message exchanges to grab the lock. Here you have to have voting. Okay, so there is basically going to be votes cast and results sent and whatnot. In the distributed one, there is, you are sent n-1 messages, you wait for n-1 reply, so it's 2n-1. In a token ring, it depends on the size of the ring. It's not 1 to infinity. Depends on the size of the ring, how much overheads are incurred for the token to come back. Okay. Look, I won't go into the delay here, but the problems are here. The coordinator can crash. The technique stops working. In the decentralized approach, there could be starvation, but otherwise there is not a whole lot of problem. In the distributed approach, as I said, crash of any process holds the system back. Okay? And in the token ring, either the lost token or a process that's holding the token going down is going to cause some trouble, okay? Because you will not be able to figure out how to regenerate the token easily. Okay? So what this should tell you is, this column should tell you, distributed locking is a non-trivial problem to implement, because when things go down, processes fail. Okay, trying to resolve that situation is a non-trivial problem. If coordinator crashes, you don't know what state the lock was. You can elect a new coordinator. That's not the problem. The problem is what state was the lock in. You don't know, because the state disappeared with the coordinator. So all these problems are non-trivial to address. Okay? Any questions on this before we move on? So we are going to switch gears and talk for the next 45 minutes or so about distributed transactions. Okay, so we are done with distributed locking. We are going to now take that and build up and start looking at distributed transaction and distributed concurrency control. So this is going to give you a little bit of flavors of how you go about implementing distributed locks to implement higher level approaches. In this case, is going to be transaction. Okay. So I presume you have at least heard the word transactions in the context of databases. Okay, I'm not going to redefine them, but I'll give you a little bit of sense of what they do. Okay. So transactions are primitives or abstractions that give you a property called atomicity. Okay, atomicity essentially means all or nothing. Okay. If you have a set of instructions, some code, and you protect it by a transaction, there's a begin transaction and an end transaction between those lines of code, then if the transaction executes, it either looks like the whole set of instructions executed atomically, they all executed all, or none of them executed. You will not have a scenario where half the instructions executed and the other half did not execute. Okay? The system is guaranteeing to you that that entire block is either going to all execute successfully, or if there's a crash or anything goes wrong, nothing would have executed. You will not have a scenario where the system says half of these instructions executed, process crashed, and the other half did not execute. Okay, the system will do something to undo the impact of the half that executed if the other half didn't execute it, so it will look like nothing executed at all. Okay. This property is referred to as atomicity. It's an important property in databases, okay, but it's also important in many other scenarios where you need the concept of a transaction. Databases actually have them built in. Okay. And now we can look at why this is important, and I'm going to show you a scenario where things can go wrong. Okay, so in this banking example, what's going on is there is a bank database with 3 accounts, account A, account B, and account C. Their balances at the beginning are $100, $200, and $300. And you want to simply perform these 2 operations. Okay? You want to transfer $4 from A to B, and you want to transfer $3 from C to B. Okay, C is giving B $3 and A is giving B $4. Okay? So what should happen if this simple operation completes successfully is, at the end of this, the bank balance at B should be 207, because you got $4 from A and $3 from C. Okay? And A should be 196 and B should be 297. Okay? Okay, so now let's look at this example where you can see what might go wrong if that operation is not implemented as a transaction. Okay. Now the way any database or any application is going to execute a request saying transfer $4 from A to B, what you are going to do is you are going to read the current account balance of A, right? You are going to deduct 4 from there. You are going to read the current balance of B, and you are going to add 4. That's how you are going to transfer money. Okay? Same with the second one, you are going to read the balance of C and subtract 6, and you are going to read the balance of B and add 3. Okay? So that's what is shown here. You are going to read A, and then you are going to update A, write A, then you are going to read B and write B. And that's timeline. So that's client 1. You read A, so the database shows 100, then you write 96 back. You deducted 4. Then let's say because these two operations are happening concurrently, things can get scheduled in arbitrary order. So there is a different thread or a different process that's also accessing the same database. It starts running, and when this is happening, this process is not running because we are doing CPU scheduling here. So we are assuming process 1 ran, 2 instructions executed, which time slot expired, process 2 ran. In this case, C is going to read, we're going to read C's balance at 300, here write C 297. So until now things are fine. And then 1 runs again, it's going to read B. Because it has to transfer 4 to B, it's going to read B, it gets its time slot expires, time slice expires. 2 runs is going to read B, it's going to get 200 still, and it's going to write 203. Okay. Then 1 runs, since it's already read B, you are going to add 4 and you are going to write 204. So at the end of this process, okay, B is left with 204, okay. A is 96, C is 297, and $3 have disappeared. Okay, because there was concurrency problems. Is that clear? What's happened? And it's clear why this has happened, because essentially these instructions essentially end up overwriting one another. Okay, they should have happened sequentially, but both of them read the value and then they overwrote one another. If this instruction had occurred after this, you would have ended up with 204. In none of these two cases would you have ended up with 207, which is the right answer. Okay. So most databases, what they would do is they will implement a property called serializability, which says that even though the processes are executing concurrently, you want them to execute as if they are the only one, sequentially. Okay, so if all of these operations had actually executed sequentially first and all these operations executed sequentially second, you wouldn't have this problem. Okay, because you would execute this, you would end up at 204, then you start executing this. So when you read this, you are actually going to read 204, add 3 and write 207, or vice versa. Okay, if they actually execute sequentially, you would not have this problem. But because they're executing concurrently, you have the problem. Okay. Now you could say, let's put a lock on the database. Okay, if you grab a lock, automatically you are going to see, make everything sequential because only one of them is going to grab a lock. Okay, if they grab a lock, you execute, and then the second one grabs the lock and you execute. Okay, and things are going to be okay as far as correctness is concerned. Okay? But in databases, that's a very bad idea. If you put a global lock on a database, it says that only one query can execute on the entire system at any given time. There are lots of queries coming in, you sequentialize everything, okay? You are going to get a really bad throughput. Okay? System performance is going to suffer because lots of concurrent users are making transactions. Okay? This is not going to work. Okay? So you can't simply say this is a shared, the database is a shared object, let's put a global lock, and now obviously you're going to have sequential execution because only one of these processes can hold the lock, the other one cannot even execute. Correctness is not going to be impacted, your correctness is fine, but performance is going to be really bad. Okay, think about, you go to a bank database and you try to withdraw money and you're told there are 100 customers withdrawing money, so you have to wait. Okay, so I cannot dispense money to you. Okay, that's simply not going to work. Okay, you want to allow concurrency. You want to actually allow multiple processes to all execute and access the shared data structure all at once. In this case, it's a database. Okay? Yet you want correctness. You don't want this problem. Okay? You want it to look like, at the end of this, it looked like they executed sequentially, but they actually executed it. That's a much more difficult problem than simply saying, let's put a lock and everything will be fine. That's a simple answer, but it's not an acceptable answer if you want higher throughput. Okay, so that is why in database allows you to have let all these queries execute concurrently, and they still give you atomicity and correctness and all of those kinds of nice properties. Okay. In our case, I'm not going to start talking about databases here. This is a course on distributed system, but what we are interested in is what are called distributed databases. Your databases themselves are replicated. Okay? How are you actually going to implement correctness? It makes problem even worse. Okay? No longer a one database, you have multiple independent copies. Okay? So it is conceivable that client 1 ran on copy 1 and client 2 ran on copy 2 and they overwrote one another. So things get even worse than what you have in a centralized database system. So you need to understand how to implement transactions and whatnot in a safe manner. Okay. So before I talk about distributed transactions and distributed concurrency control, give a little more background on what you do in databases. In databases, relational database systems, you have property called ACID properties. I assume some of you at least heard of ACID properties. Yes? ACID is an acronym, stands for atomicity, consistency, isolation, and durability. Okay, those are the 4 terms. So atomicity says all or nothing. Okay? Meaning that client 1 has executed all 4 of his instructions or nothing. Okay? Regardless of what happens, whether client crashes, doesn't crash, your system is not going to be left in a state where process 1 or client 1 started executing its transaction and halfway through it crashed. Okay? Now you are left a database in an even more inconsistency. You did not even finish what you started with. Okay? You cannot have that happen. Okay? It's going to impact correctness of your system. Okay, you cannot have money in a bank disappear because you withdrew it from one account, but before you deposit it in the second account, the process crashed. Okay, that you cannot have. So it should either be all of these executed successfully or none of them executed. If you crash in the middle, you have to somehow undo whatever you've done so that you leave it, go back to the state you started. So it is as if that process never even executed in the system. Okay, that is atomicity. Okay. Consistency simply says each transaction is going to take the system from one consistent state to another. If you start in a consistent state, you let some transactions run. If any transaction finishes, you are going to be in another consistent state. You are not going to go into some inconsistent state like you had here. Okay, in the previous case, you violated consistency. You went from a consistent state to what is clearly an inconsistent state. This should not have happened. Okay, you overrode transactions, overrode one another. So consistency is something that will take the transaction from one system from one consistency to another. Isolation, the third property, it's also called serializability. Yes, if you've heard of the term serializability and isolation, they mean the same thing. And basically what those basically mean or say is that even though transactions are executing concurrently, their effect on the system is as if they executed sequentially like this. Okay, so you are actually going to have client 1 and client 2 execute sequentially, but if you look at the state of the database at the end of this process, okay, it will look like, it seemed like client 1 executed and then client 2 or client 2 and 1. Okay, that they went in some order, even though they actually executed concurrently. So it will look like they're executing one at a time as far as the actual state or values in the database are concerned. You can reason about this, saying, because I'm in this state, it looks like this one ran and that one ran, even though they actually ran concurrently. You can reason about them as if they were serialized. Serialized means they went sequentially, one at a time. Okay? So that allows us automatically to give consistency guarantees, even though you are not actually doing this one at a time. Okay? But it looks like the effect is as if it ran one at a time, so you are always consistent. And durability essentially says that once you commit the changes to this, once you write whatever you are doing to this, then you cannot undo it. Then the changes are permanent. But while the transaction is executing, you have the ability to undo things and go back to a previous state as if nothing had happened. Okay? So this is a very high level 2-slide introduction to whatever is happening in databases, because we are going to use that to implement distributed transaction systems. Any questions on this? Okay, all relational databases are going to give you some form of asset properties. Okay, so these are important properties to ensure that the database is actually going to be in a consistent state. Okay, you will not have the problems that I talked about. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about transactional primitives and we start to build them from there. So essentially, if you want a transactional system, you can take any code that you write in any program and encapsulate that with a begin transaction and end transaction. In all of that code, in between the begin and the end, the system will ensure these properties for you. Okay, so here is an example where you're making, let's say, an airline reservation. Okay, so that's what we'll do. And let's assume you want to go, in this case, from the textbook example, New York to New Delhi, and there's no direct flight between those two cities. So you have to go through a sequence of intermediate flights. Okay. So you want to make a booking where you have to actually, to make a travel booking, you have to essentially book 3 individual segments. Okay. Now there's no point saying I only booked 1 segment, the other 2 I didn't book, because either all of them have to succeed, or even if one doesn't succeed, nothing has to succeed. Okay, because you cannot make the journey if you only have 2 segments, not the third. You can go from point A to point. So then you basically put this whole thing in a transaction which says, go and reserve a segment from New York to Paris, and then Paris to Athens and Athens to Delhi. If any of them actually fail, then abort the whole transaction. That means undo whatever you have done so far, as if you haven't done the booking at all. Okay, because a partial booking is as good as no booking, so you want to undo. Okay, so you encapsulated this whole thing in a transaction. So if the transaction succeeds, at the end of this, you will have all 3 segments. The transaction doesn't succeed, then you don't have a partial state where you booked some segment, not other segment. You undo everything. Okay? That is what is abort transaction, when you would say undo everything you have done so far. Okay? That's an example of making a booking which involves multiple smaller bookings. Okay? You could do the same thing. You may say, I need a hotel and I need a plane ticket, and I'm going to go to an airline database and I'm going to go to a hotel database. Obviously, I don't want a hotel room if I can't get a flight, or I don't want to get a flight if there's no place to stay when I get there. Okay, so you want both of them to succeed or neither to succeed. Okay. So that brings us to this notion of a distributed transaction, where the example I just gave you, which is the airline database and the hotel database, are 2 smaller transactions, and this transaction is nested in a bigger transaction. Okay, so now you have nested transactions where you may have begin and end transactions inside another begin and end transaction. Okay, so you may have begin transaction, end transaction, there's another begin and end, say, go get me an airline ticket. Okay, and then that may itself require you to do multiple segments and whatnot. And then there is another begin and end that says, go get me a hotel room. Okay? And then if one of them fails, then the other one has to be undone. Okay, so what you will see in this case, what has happened is you have the nested transaction, and the sub-transactions are actually operating on independent database. Okay, the airline may have its own database, the hotel companies may have their own database. So this basically forks of independent transactions. If they both succeed, then the nested transaction itself succeeds. For the parent transaction, then nested them succeeds. So this is an example of nested transaction. And this is again a database concept. What we are going to do is not this, but we are going to implement what is called a distributed transaction. In a distributed transaction, you don't have independent databases, but rather your database itself is distributed. Okay, so you have 2 copies, or you split the database into smaller databases, and it gives an illusion of a single larger logical database. Okay, that's what is shown here. So maybe your airline database is too large. Okay? You maintain a database per continent. Global airline, so you have a US reservation database and the Europe reservation database. So now if you want to make a booking, your transaction is going to hit multiple partitions of your database. Okay? So your distributed transaction will have sub-transactions that go and operate on independent pieces, and either again all will succeed or none will succeed. Okay? So similar concept to nested transaction, except that there is no real nesting. The database itself is distributed, so internally you have to go and touch different replicas or different parts, components of the logical database. Is that clear? So now the question is, what we do to implement distributed transactions? Okay, how do we go about it, and what kinds of techniques are available? That's what we are going to look at next. Okay, I'm going to show you two techniques, okay, which are actually taken directly from the standard database approaches. Okay. One is called private workspaces and the other one is called write-ahead logs. Okay, we'll talk about each of them a little bit. So here is a sort of a picture that shows you what private workspaces do. Okay. In a private workspace, think of it when a transaction starts up. Okay. Assume that you could make a copy of your entire database and give it to the transactions, and this is your private copy. Okay. Go do whatever you want on this copy. Now if the transaction aborts in the middle, meaning it fails for any reason, you just throw away that copy because you haven't made any changes to the actual database. You got a private copy to work with. Okay? That's what is called a private workspace. On the other hand, if your transaction completes successfully, you take the changes that were made to the private copy and you actually propagate them to the main database. In that case, the changes become permanent. Okay? So the idea is whenever a transaction starts, you are going to give it its own private copy of the database or the distributed database. It operates on the private copy. While it is operating on the private copy, any changes it has made are not visible to any other transaction because they will be operating on their own copies or they'll be accessing the master database. They don't have access to the private copy. And so all changes are local until the transaction commits, at which point they become visible globally. That's essentially what is shown in this picture, where it's a very straightforward example where your database has three records, record 0, 1 and 2, that's the index. Okay. And then what you are going to do is you are going to actually give a copy of this, okay. But when I said you make a copy, you are not going to actually make a real copy. Okay. That's not going to work. If you have 10 gigabyte database, every time a transaction starts up, you don't make a 10 gigabyte copy and give it to the database. Okay. You're going to actually be smarter than that, you're going to give it a virtual copy. Okay. Virtual copy is essentially the same as the physical copy, which says until you make changes, the copies are the same. Okay. When you make changes, you are going to implement a technique called copy on write or cow techniques. Anyone heard copy on write? Some people are nodding. Okay, what is it? What is copy on write? Standard systems technique. Nothing to do with distributed systems, operating systems, not systems.
There are replicas present at every system, and if there is a change made by one of them, then it is being copied.
Okay. So copy on write, yes, so the idea is whatever was mentioned here. Copy on write, as the name suggests, is you make a copy when you write to something. Okay, that's why it's called copy on write. It's actually a standard technique used in file systems to make very efficient copies. Okay, so here let's say there's a file. Okay. File has some blocks. You make a copy of the file. Okay, if you actually do CP and you make a copy, you assume that one way to do this is to make a physical copy. Okay, so now there are two copies, and now if you modify the second copy, this copy will now be different from the first. Okay, so if you modify, let's say, that block, and these two blocks are going to be different, the rest of it are going to be the same. Okay? That's making a physical copy. The copy on write essentially says, let's make a virtual copy. Virtual copy says, I'm going to have an index or a set of pointers that point to the block of the file. When I make a copy, I simply make a copy of the index. So initially, those are pointing to the same block. So you haven't copied the data at all. Okay? You have two files. Okay, this is file A and file B. File B is a copy of A, but file B is simply pointing to the same physical data as A. And until B changes or A changes anything, there is no reason to make a physical copy. They are the same one and the same data. Okay. Now, if some application opens file B and makes a change, let's say it goes and overwrites block 1. Okay. This is where you use a copy on write. It says now that you have modified block 1, you can no longer have these two pointers pointing to the same block. Instead, you're actually going to make a copy of this, okay, and then modify it, and then this one will point. The unchanged blocks are still going to be shared. Only the changed blocks are going to be different. Okay. So this makes it very efficient to make copies. Okay. because all you're doing is you're copying a set of pointers. So if you have a 10 gigabyte database, you want to make a copy, you simply make a new index, it's pointing to exactly the same blocks. There's nothing you need to do to actually make a copy. You only may duplicate the blocks when somebody is writing to one of them. Okay, so at that point, the two copies are going to diverge from one another. Okay, so this technique, if you haven't heard of this, you should, because it's a very standard technique. It's called cow or copy or write. It's often used to make very efficient virtual copies, where the only once you make writes to one of the copies will they diverge. Otherwise, they are pointing to the same content. Okay, so we are going to use cow techniques to implement transactions. And what is going to happen is you have a database. Okay. When a transaction starts up, you give it a virtual copy of the database. That's this index. Okay, so essentially when the transaction starts up, you are given the same copy as the original database. Now the transaction is obviously going to start making modifications to the database. It's going to read and write records. So in this case, what you see is it has kind of probably it's hard to see, but it has actually overwritten block 0 and is written a new block 3. Okay, so you will see that 1 and 2 are still pointing to the same copy. This is the original database. That is the private workspace of the transaction, where blocks 1 and 2 are unchanged, so both of the indexes point to the same blocks. Okay. 0 has been overwritten to 0 prime, so you'll see that there's original block 0 that belongs to the old database, and block 0 prime has been returned to disk, and now this copy is pointing to 0 prime. And there's copy 3 is a new block that's been written, so you have pointer to 3. Okay. So these are all local changes this transaction makes to its workspace, its copy. These changes are not visible at the database level yet. Now, if you have to simply abort the transaction, undo its effect, there is nothing to do because you never even wrote to the database. You simply delete this and those blocks are gone, 0 prime and 3 prime, and then nothing has actually happened to the database. So it's very easy to undo changes. If a transaction fails or it aborts or anything happens that require you to undo its effect, then you simply throw away the private copy. Main database has not been modified yet, so there's nothing to do. Okay. Now, on the other hand, if the transaction is going to commit, say all the changes were successful, it's time to commit the transaction. What you're going to do is take the changed blocks from the transactions workspace and you're going to propagate them to the main database. So after this is done, you will see that now 0 points to the new version of 0. The old version of 0 has been deleted and has gone. Block 3 has been inserted into the database, or record number 3 has been inserted into it. So now the database view is the same as whatever the transaction did because you merged the changes. At this point, you cannot undo the transaction. The transaction is committed, the changes are durable, they become visible. You cannot go back after this point. Okay? So this is an idea of using a private workspace to implement a transaction. You can use the same idea to implement distributed transaction. Okay, and whenever the transaction touches a database, you give it a virtual copy, say go do whatever changes you want. When it's time to commit, you will propagate it. Okay? That's one idea of how you implement transaction systems. Any questions here? That is what cow means, right? So you're not actually making a copy, you're making two virtual copies where both copies are pointing to the same physical data. Okay, so essentially, if there are only reads in the transaction, there's nothing you need to do. You're simply giving it a workspace where the data is the same, both copies share the same data. Okay, so that is essentially what is copy and write, and it is optimized for write by copying only whatever you change. So that is essentially these two statements are what copy and write techniques do. Okay.
This is just to ensure the atomicity of the operation. This doesn't ensure like the consistency. There may be another process reading the same data.
Yes. So the question is, this is only doing consistency, it's not doing anything for concurrency. So we'll talk about concurrency control in a minute or two, because at the moment we haven't said what happens if two transactions are operating at the same time. How do you ensure that when they commit, you're going to get all the asset properties? That technique is called concurrency control. We haven't come to that. We're going to build up. This one is simply saying I can undo. It doesn't say I can be consistent if two of them go and override one another. That can still happen. Okay? Because the previous Ireland example, you have workspace 1, workspace 2, and both commit, and one goes and overrides the changes on the other, and then you're stuck. You will not get what you want. There's a second technique for implementing transactions, and that is called write-ahead logs. Okay? So in this case, the idea is straightforward. You are not going to give any transaction a private copy. Okay? You are going to let the transactions go and actually make changes to the global database. Okay? So it is going to go and start modifying the database. Okay? So now if you do that and the transaction fails, you have to have a way to undo your changes. Okay? So you say, go and add $5 to this account balance. Okay? Instead of making that change to a private copy, you are going to go and actually modify the database in place, and you are going to go and add $5. Okay? Then you may say, now go and undo. Transaction is aborted. So you need to go and figure out how to actually go back and undo. Okay, so question is, how would you do that? If you make in-place changes, rather than making changes to a private copy, you make in-place changes and now you want to roll back. Undoing is also called rollback. How would you do it?
You have the red value in your local workspace.
There is no workspace.
Okay.
Because private workspace is the previous concept. Here each transaction, all transactions are allowed access to the global database, and they are merrily going and or writing whatever they want. Some transaction fails, you need to go and undo whatever it is. The question is how will you do it? Okay, the first thing is you have to track whatever a transaction did, so you can actually go and figure out what to undo. Okay, if you don't know what it did, there is nothing you can do about undoing it. Okay, the way we are going to do this, or the way databases do it, is they have something called a log file. Okay? That is what a write-ahead log says. In the log file, whatever changes you are making to the master database is also tracked. Okay, you say, I am updating record 10, previous value was this, new value is this. You are going to write that into a log file. Okay? So if you want to undo a transaction, you go and see what changes were made are explicitly tracked in the log file, so you go and undo them. Okay? You can say, this is what happened, so to undo it, I have to reverse whatever it did. Okay? So you are going to go and do what is called do a rollback. Okay? So two ideas, I'm going to give you an example in just a moment. So you have in-place updates, where transactions are making direct changes to files, objects, databases. Your write-ahead log, which is prior to making any change, transaction is going to write whatever change is about to make to stable storage. It's going to write it out to disk. And it will have the transaction ID, block number, and whatnot. And then basically, if you commit, there is nothing to do. If you abort, you read the log records and you undo the changes. This is called rolling back, or undoing the changes. Okay? And logs can be used also in failures, which you will see. Okay, we need the commit to be atomic. That was the point was made. I'll talk about concurrency control. Okay? Here's a very simple, it's not a database example, but an extremely simple example of what a log looks like. Okay? So here the database has two records. We're assuming that X and Y are the two records. The values are 0. Okay? The transaction, you're going to add 1 to X, add 2 to Y, and you're going to do some other term. So basically here is what the log is. A log says I'm modifying X, value before modification is 0, after modification is 1. Okay, the next statement executes, I'm modifying Y, value of Y is 0 before, after is 2. Okay. And then you execute the third one, says value of X and modifying X is 1 and value is 4. Okay. Now if the transaction fails, you simply go back and look at the log in reverse order and you just replay the log. Okay, you undo it. So in this case you are simply blindly going to say, okay, go take X, okay, value should be 4, replace it by 1. Okay, so and then say you go to the previous entry, say, okay, go to Y, value should be 2, replace it by 0. You're going to go back to X and the value should be 1, go back to 0. So at this point you restored X and Y to 0, 0, or whatever value you have. Okay, so essentially the idea is you simply write to a separate file, not the main file, whatever changes you are making, and you make the changes to the master. And if the transaction fails, you go and look at the log and replay it in reverse order. You're done. You have done the changes. Okay, this is how any transactional system would work. File systems also use the notion of logs for the same purpose. They are going to write out whatever they're doing, so if the OS crashes or whatever, you can go back to a consistent state. Okay, is that clear? So now, having talked about both the private workspace and the log-based techniques, we are going to now look at the problem of concurrency control, which is what was mentioned earlier. So now our goal is we want to have maximum concurrency. We want to allow multiple transactions to all execute concurrently. Okay, multiple requests come in, let them all execute. Don't have a global lock which says one request at a time. That's not going to work. Okay, throughput is going to fall. Okay, so we want multiple transactions to execute. Okay, and yet we want at the end of this database to be in a state as if one transaction had executed at a time, not that they were all executing at the same time. That is serializability. Okay. So that is going to be a consistent state. If you let n transactions all execute, but the end result is as if they are executed in a certain order. What order we don't care, but as long as they executed, or it looks like they executed in a certain order, and that's the result you get, you are happy. That's a fine end result. You're not in an inconsistent state. You're not overwriting one another. That's really the thing you're trying to avoid. Is that clear? That's the goal of concurrency control. How to do it, we are going to look at. So final result should be the same as if each transaction executed sequentially. So concurrency control can be implemented in many different ways. Okay. This is an example of how databases work. So you have three layers. Your transaction manager, you have a scheduler, and your data manager. Only these two are important. Transaction manager tracks things at the granularity of transaction, begin transaction, end transaction. You can write a log, you can undo. Now, as and when you make modifications to records, you want to at least grab a lock on that record. You're not grabbing a global lock on the database. But a single record you cannot overwrite. Two transactions cannot overwrite it. So locking is going to be more fine-grained. It's going to be at the granularity of individual records, or even in some cases individual fields of a record. So one entry in the database. If you want to update it, you basically grab a lock on that entry, update it, and release the lock. Other transactions can access other records in the database. That's fine. Okay, so think of an airline database where there are lots of flights. If I'm trying to book a flight to New York, okay, that's one entry somewhere or some set of entries in the database. Somebody else is trying to book a flight to California. They are two independent things. There is no conceivable reason they are actually going to have to go one at a time. But if two passengers are both trying to book a ticket to New York both at the same time, okay, that's modifying the same entry. Okay, you don't want both of them to execute at once, because then you may have a case where you sold the last ticket to two passengers. Okay, that's going to be a bad situation. Okay, I'd like to do it anyway, but that's a deliberate thing, not because of bugs in their database. Okay. So essentially you still need locking, but locking is going to be more fine-grained. It's not global lock at a database level, it's going to be locks at granularity of records and so on. And that is what the scheduler is going to do. The data manager is simply reading or writing data to this. Here is basically how this works in a distributed setting. Your database is spread across three machines, A, B, and C. Okay. There's a transaction manager is going to be one, which is basically some centralized entity that's going to track which transactions are started, which ones are ended, which ones need to be undone, which ones to commit, and so on. Okay. And then basically as and when the transaction makes statements, you're going to send it to the right copy. Okay. Or if there are replicas, you send it to multiple. The schedulers will take locks on whatever records and update them and so on. So that's essentially what's happening. Your transaction manager operates at the layer abstraction of transaction. Schedulers are actually going to go and do the work of your updating record 10, grab a lock on record 10, update it, release the lock. So it's going to do all of that for you. Okay. Now I didn't tell you the algorithm that ensures correctness. We are going to come to that. This is just the architectural picture of how things work. Okay, so before we talk about algorithms, I'm going to give you some examples of what serializability means. Okay? So we are going to reason about serializability a little bit, okay? So that you get the idea of what the transactional layer has to do to ensure serializability. Okay? So this is again a very simple example. We are going to assume that there are three transactions that are running at the same time. They all operate on a single record in the database, record X. Okay? and we let them run in parallel. Okay. At the end of this, we are going to be left with a state, database state, and we want to argue, is this a valid state or an invalid state? And this, depending on whether the transactions are actually serializable or not, we will see that in some cases they are overriding one another, that's not serializable. In some other cases they will be. Okay. And the goal is to at least reason by looking at this picture whether this makes sense or not. Okay. The system would have to do this automatically using logs and so on. So these are the three transactions. Okay. Each transaction is simply resetting x to 0, and this one is adding 1 to x, that is adding 2 to x, and that's adding 3 to x. Okay, so three transactions, they're all executing in parallel. Okay. So now, although they're executing in parallel, what we want is the database state should be such that they are executed in some order. And what order, we don't care. We assume that it should be as if there was a global lock, as if each transaction took the lock one at a time, and they executed, and then the next one executed, and next one. So pick any order. Any order is okay. So if you have a state, if you're left with a state such that there is at least one order that you can find that explains that state, then your system is in a correct state. If there's no ordering you can find that would actually result in that state, that means something went wrong. Okay? So let's try to think about this, right? So pick an order. So now depending on what order you pick, okay, you are going to be left in a certain state. Okay, in this case, I simplified the algorithm, the transaction a little bit, because what's happening is each transaction is simply resetting x to 0. So it's undoing whatever the previous transaction has done and simply then adding 1, 2, or 3. Okay. So now, depending on the order, depending on which of these transactions went last, okay, the database value is going to be 1, 2, or 3. Okay, because you can pick a order saying this one went, then that one, and that one. So after this executes, x is 1. This is going to reset x to 0 and then make x 2, and that one is going to reset x is going to be 3. Okay, so if these went in that order, you will be left with x equals to 3 in the database. Okay. If they went in the reverse order, you will be left with 1. What's the database state? If you go CBA, 1, right? And it doesn't matter, you basically just execute them in that order, say, okay, I execute this, I execute this, I execute this. Okay. So now you can pick any order. In this case, because we simplified it, you can reason that the database state at the end of the three transactions executing can be either 1, 2, or 3. All three are correct states as far as we are concerned, because there is some ordering you can pick which will put you in that state. Okay? But if you get some other value that's different from 1, 2, or 3, you say that's incorrect. I cannot find any conceivable way they can execute sequentially and get into that state, even though I'm letting them run in parallel. Okay? So that's how you have to reason. So now here is what is actually may happen in the system. Right? Since they're executing in parallel, you'll see that there's an arbitrary interleaving of the 6 statements because they're executing in parallel. And at the end of those 6 statements, we have to say, is this okay or not okay? Okay, so in this case, what you have is, this is an interleaving that he came up with. Like these 2 statements executed and then something else happened and so on. So in this case, you are going to be left with x equals to 3. Okay, because we are going to basically, and say that's legal. Okay, we agree, because if you have an order where the third transaction went last, you will end up in that state. So we accept that as a legal ordering or a legal interleaving. Okay. Here also you are left with x equals to 3. Okay. The last one you are going to end up with x equals 5. Okay, because the interleaving, what has happened is you basically have x equal to 0 execute, then the last statement of this transaction executes, and the last statement of that transaction. So this one is going to give you a database value and x is 5. And you are going to say that is illegal because there is no way this transaction can actually execute one at a time and end up with x equal to 5. Is that clear? This is us reasoning. The system has to do this automatically. You just need to understand. This is a simple example actually taken from the book to understand what serializability means. Okay, so they're executing in parallel, and you have these arbitrary interleavings where the statements are just getting executed in some order. At the end of this, you have to ask, is this legal or illegal? Okay. So the key idea here is you want to ensure that if there are conflicts of this sort, okay, where you're overwriting one another or overwriting some changes, you want to flag it and then abort the transaction. Okay, the question is, how would you do it? I'm going to give you a 1 minute version of this and then we are going to stop. Okay. The first idea is actually very straightforward. This one is called optimistic concurrency control. Okay. The whole field of concurrency control has two types of techniques. One is called optimistic, the other one is called pessimistic. Okay. Not surprisingly, they're opposites of one another. In optimistic concurrency control, you basically take an optimistic view. Okay. You will say transactions rarely conflict with one another. Okay. So I'm going to let them run and do whatever they want. Okay. When time comes to commit, I'm going to go and do some check. Did something bad happen? If something bad happened, I'm going to undo the transaction. But if they're doing independent things, then nothing needs to be done. Let them finish. Okay. So in optimistic concurrency control, you don't even use locks. You take a very optimistic way saying, no locking, do what you want. I'm going to, every time something commits, I'm going to check. Did something bad happen? If something bad happens, I'm going to start rolling back transactions. If nothing bad happened, these transactions are acting on independent flights in my airline database, they will never conflict because they're doing independent things. Okay, so and by and large, that's a good observation, which is in large databases, transactions work on different parts of the database. They're independent. They never conflict. So why have locks to begin with? Why have the overhead of acquiring a lock when nothing else ever conflicts with it? So let's eliminate locks altogether. Let transactions do what they want. And at the end of the day, when each one transaction is committing, I'm going to make some checks. And I'm going to basically flag problems like this, saying this shouldn't have happened. So I'm going to undo those two transactions which conflicted. Okay, so this is a one slide one slide explanation of optimistic concurrency control. Clearly, you will need to figure out when transactions conflict. Okay, this works well with private workspaces, okay, because each transaction is given its own thing. There is no lock. When you commit, you say, okay, you made changes to these two records. After you started, this other transaction also made changes to these two records, so that's clearly a conflict. So I'm going to let you know. Or when you say, okay, after you started, no one has ever touched these two records that you changed, so there is no conflict. So I'm going to let you commit. Okay, you just have to make these checks and let them commit. Okay. So the advantage is clearly it's going to be deadlock free. Why? There are no locks. So it's an optimistic concurrency control, no locks. Okay. So you can never have a scenario where there are deadlocks, which you can get in pessimistic. Maximum parallelism. Okay, no locks, no blocking, maximum parallelism. Okay. So those are all great things. Okay, you're going to get very high performance, there's no overhead blocking and so on. The disadvantage is the probability of conflicts rises as the load increases in the system. As there's more load, more concurrent transactions, the probability that any two transaction conflicts will keep going up. Okay? So at very high loads, there may be always some transactions that conflict, so you have to keep redoing work, you abort and restart. Okay, so your good put, your throughput may be high, but your good put, which is the percentage of successful transaction drops, even though the percentage of executing transactions keeps rising. Okay. So in pessimistic concurrency or optimistic concurrency control, at low to moderate loads, all is good. Okay, you are getting good performance, no overhead. At very high load, things may go wrong, but the probability of things going wrong keeps rising. Okay, and you may have lots of aborts in the system for no apparent reason. Okay. So we'll continue this discussion on Wednesday. Let's stop here and I'll talk about pessimistic concurrency control as well.